How's everyone doing today? Welcome back to another episode of The Banker Next Door. This is the Lords of Easy Money series, and we are continuing with part 11 today. Before we begin, I'm just going to bring our trusty PowerPoint slide in here to help guide us along. So real quick, I just want to start with an overview of Chapter 8. So in Chapter 8 here, this was basically Jeremy Powell's chapter. So it had kind of his whole backstory, his whole career. And so we start off with basically Jeremy Powell and his early years in Washington, D.C. And then we get into Powell as he gets through law school and he kind of becomes known as like an effective operator. He then goes to work for the law firm of Dillon Reed and Company. We then get into a really good conversation and try to develop an understanding of not only corporate debt, but what is a corporate bond and what is a corporate loan. Then we continue on with Jeremy Powell's career as he moves to the Treasury, kind of starts to get a little bit more in the political power moves, so to speak. And while he's at the Treasury, he uncovers basically what becomes known as the Salmon Brothers big corruption scheme in the Treasury's market. So, and then Warren Buffett gets involved in there at the end as he comes in and basically takes over Salmon Brothers and then kind of works out a bailout plan of sorts, if you will, with Jeremy Powell. Powell then has to go and testify in front of Congress for what he did, even though he gets pillared in front of Congress. Basically, he impressed his boss, impresses other, powerful people around the D.C. area. And so they basically liked his performance. So he got a lot of kudos for that. And then basically just because of election cycles like George H.W. Bush did not get reelected in 1992, as Bill Clinton did. So Powell decides he leaves the Treasury and then he moves to the Carlyle Group. Now, while he's at the Carlyle Group, he does a deal with a company called Rexnord. And the Rexnord deal, after he basically loads the company up with debt, sells it off to Apollo Management and makes an enormous windfall. We don't know exactly how much he makes, but it's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 to $50 million, something in that neighborhood. Basically life-changing sum of money. Let's just put it that way. And then at the very end of the chapter, we wrap up with basically the crippling effects of a debt-heavy world. What has the whole quantitative easing and the time of ZIRP and zero interest rate policy and all this debt that is now being put onto these companies and through the corporate bond market, through corporate loans, and how ultimately this is playing out. So that was kind of the review of Chapter 8. Now today we're going to go into Chapter 9, which is called The Risk Machine, and we're going to cover the years of 2010 through 2015. And basically we're going to see kind of the churn and burn, the factory style application of these CLOs, collateralized loan obligation loans, so CLO loans. We're going to see how these things got churned out by the big banks. We're going to, in particular, we're going to look at Credit Suisse, and we're going to see how they do it. But then ultimately, as we go through the chapter, we're also going to see how did this affect the everyday person? How did this ultimately come back to your regular company and your regular employee, and ultimately how did that play out for them? So, okay, so let's get rolling here. So, some of the most profitable products created by Rexnord were not created on the company's factory floors. They were created hundreds of miles away in a stately skyscraper with vaulted archways over its entryways, located at the corner of Madison Avenue and 25th Street in the heart of Manhattan, New York City. This is where Robert Hetu arrived early in the morning on most workdays, so he could get a jump on his day as a managing director at Credit Suisse. He worked in the division that created and sold leveraged loans. Many of them originated from Rexnord's headquarters in Milwaukee. Rexnord's might have been an obscure company that occupied old factories and shabby neighborhoods, but it provided a fountain of prosperous work for the debt engineers on Wall Street. Hetu's office overlooked Madison Square Park, but everyone was working too hard by the middle of the morning to enjoy the view. The private offices for managing directors like Hetu were arranged around a central pen of cubicles staffed by an overworked team of junior analysts and associates. Hetu had been one of these associates years earlier and had grown accustomed to the grinding pressures of the job. It was a 7 days a week endeavor, and not in the metaphorical sense that the job was always hanging over you. The junior employees were at work literally every day, sometimes for years on end, making frantic phone calls on Sunday afternoon to finalize the details on a bond issue or leveraged loan. Even after Hetu was promoted to managing director, he arrived at the office around 7 in the morning and left at 7 in the evening, giving him a couple of hours to see his kids before they went to bed, which was when he started working the phones again. Hetu took a vacation once to a luxury resort in Shangri-La, China, where he joined his family in a tour van to see the countryside and ended up on his cell phone in meetings with a lawyer. That's the lifestyle. You get rewarded for it, but there's a price to pay, Hetu recalled. So again, Robert Hetu, he works at Credit Suisse, and we're going to see this, but we started out here just to see kind of what's the lifestyle like for the bankers that work in this, this end of the business, and what's this like. And basically we see that this becomes an all encompassing 7-day a week. You never get a day off. You never get a moment's rest. And you just work, and it's just nonstop. There's just no break whatsoever. Even when this dude's on vacation, he's on a tour trying to see the countryside. And he ends up getting stuck on phone calls with lawyers for hours trying to take care of stuff. So, and as you said, I mean, that's the lifestyle. Now, the other side of the coin here is that these guys get ridiculously compensated for what they do. I mean, these guys make millions and millions of dollars. This isn't like, somebody making $100,000 a year. I mean, these guys are making millions of dollars. So, and the deals that they put together equate to hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. So, again, just to get a flavor for that. So, okay, now we're going to continue on here again with kind of the lifestyle. So, the incentive to live this life was obvious. A single managing director at Credit Suisse could generate tens of millions of dollars worth of fees in a year for the bank and take home a cut of the money. There was never a shortage of fees to earn because the world of corporate debt was an ever-turning wheel of new loans that replaced old loans as the debt was rolled over again and again. When Apollo bought Rexnord, for example, it borrowed the money through leveraged loans that it rolled over repeatedly. Each refinancing generated fees for Credit Suisse. The benefit to Rexnord was keeping its debt afloat at relatively low interest rates. This was why people like Hetu were on the phone all the time, usually with lawyers. Hetu helped Rexnord refinance $1 billion in debt in March of 2012, and the contract for the deal was 344 pages long. Virtually all of the paragraphs in those 344 pages were produced under heavy scrutiny, negotiation, and anxiety. A successful debt contract contained a multitude of components that had to fit together snugly, immune from legal challenges, in such a way that it would entice outside investors to buy the debt. Selling the debt was crucial for the business model to work. Credit Suisse arranged the leveraged loans, but never meant to keep a lot of them. They're not in the storage business, they're in the moving business, Hetu said. The moving business was usually brisk. Hetu and his team arranged debt deals, then syndicated the loans and sold them to institutional investors like pension funds. This was still something of a niche business in 2006 when Apollo bought Rexnord. The big investors like pension funds or insurance companies shied away from buying leveraged loans because they were considered somewhat opaque and risky. This changed in 2010 when the Federal Reserve began its second round of quantitative easing and kept interest rates pinned at zero. When the Fed pumped trillions of dollars into the banking system and harshly disciplined anybody who tried to save it, the cash was forced toward the offices of Credit Suisse. Hetu saw the change clearly. There was so much cash and so few places for that cash to go. With more capital that's available, then you've got to find product, Hetu said. So again, now we're seeing this shift. We're seeing this shift where Hetu was running this leverage loan, basically syndicated loans, leverage loans to Credit Suisse. And it was, there was always stuff going on, but it was basically like the business had just been turned into hyperdrive in 2010 when the Fed decided to just turn on the printing press and keep interest rates pinned at zero. It was like just full throttle ahead. You're blasting off to space at this point. So, okay, now we're going to continue on with the product. The product in this case was a company like Rexnord that was willing to take on more debt. In America, the supply of such companies seemed almost limitless. If entrepreneurial optimism was America's greatest resource, then the leveraged loan market was harvesting it, providing debt to anyone who could dream up a way to spend it. There was, however, a natural limit to this system, and it was in the banking system's tolerance for risk. Credit Suisse was in the moving business. It didn't want to keep the leveraged loan on its books as much as it wanted to reap the fees from selling the loans. Credit Suisse needed a supply of outside buyers if it wanted to expand its business. When the tidal wave of QE cash arrived on Wall Street, it created a new opening for banks like Credit Suisse, an opening that would expand their leveraged loan business to an unprecedented scale. This would be made possible by something called the Collateralized Loan Obligation, or CLO for short. So, and now we get into the CLO. So this name, CLO, might sound familiar to big fans of the 2008 financial crisis. In 2008, the market imploded thanks to an exotic debt product called the Collateralized Debt Obligation, or CDO. The CDO was a package of home loans or derivatives contracts based on home loans stacked together and sold to investors. The CDO made the housing crash possible by creating a seamless assembly line that allowed mortgage brokers to create risky subprime home loans that were quickly packaged and sold to investors, which in turn allowed the mortgage brokers to extend yet more new loans. At that time, the lowly CLO was the undernoticed stepchild of the debt markets. There were only about $300 billion worth of CLOs during the global financial crisis of 2008, while in 2006 alone, about 1.1 trillion of new CDOs were issued. But the important thing about CLOs was that they didn't suffer nearly the losses that CDOs suffered. When Wall Street emerged from the rubble of the crash around 2010, CLOs gained a reputation as a relatively safe investment. Credit Suisse was a leading producer of CLOs. It issued 11 between 2010 and the first half of 2014, worth a total of $6.7 billion, making it the third largest CLO dealer in the country. Robert Hitu found himself at the epicenter of this new debt assembly machine. He and his team had deep expertise in arranging new leveraged loans, which they could then sell to CLO managers. The barrier to making new leveraged loans had been broken down. But there was another Credit Suisse executive who was crucial to breaking down that barrier. That's because it wasn't just the size and volume of the CLO machine that made it so important. It was also the ways the deals were structured. Leveraged loans were once the domain of private equity firms like Carlyle and Apollo, which were comfortable with the complicated and non-standardized terms set out in a 344-page deal. The CLO made leveraged loans an off-the-shelf chain store product. And that was thanks to people like John Popp, the head of Credit Suisse's CLO unit. Okay, now we're going to get into John Popp and how were institutional investors supposed to earn a yield on their pools of cash when the Fed kept interest rates pinned at zero? Yes, very interesting. Okay, so Popp looks like a trustworthy guy. He wears the pinstripe suit uniform of any good banker, has close-cut gray hair, and a cherubic smile. Cherubic smile that highlights high cheekbones. In May of 2012, Popp put out a document that was basically an invitation for people to pour their retirement savings into CLOs. The document was called a white paper, and it was published by Credit Suisse's Credit Investment Group. The white paper addressed a vexing problem faced by conservative institutional investors. How were they supposed to earn a yield on their pools of cash when the Fed kept interest rates pinned at zero? This was a matter of survival for pension funds and insurance companies. In a 0% world, these companies were suddenly underfunded. So in other words, as we had talked before, particularly for the pension funds and the insurance companies, they survived for so many years on just buying bonds, on buying treasuries, even buying commercial real estate that pay, they could earn 6%. They go put money in a CD, earn 4 or 5% rate of return. Earning that basic rate of return was what enabled to them to comfortably return a rate to the owners and holders of those pensions and the shareholders of the insurance companies to, again, these were generally thought of as very boring type enterprises where, they're just, your pension fund, you're just managing the funds of the retirees. You're just trying to, make them 5 to 8% every year. Insurance companies are the same thing. Like these are supposed to be very unsexy businesses, but suddenly they found themselves in this 0% interest rate world where where are you getting yield? There are no bonds or treasuries to buy that will pay you a decent return. There is no CD to get from the bank. Real estate's still there. But real estate, had just gone through this major crash and was still recovering. So now that being said, they had been counting on interest rates to pay them a certain amount of money every year because that's how things had been for decades. Pop was sensitive to this problem. His paper began with a question posed somewhat plaintively. What can investors do when real yields on 10-year treasuries are negative? Luckily, Pop had a solution to the dilemma. His paper politely suggested that institutional investors consider investing in a type of debt that was once seen as too arcane and opaque, like leveraged loans. If investors were willing to take on a little more risk, they could explore the middle-tiered varieties of corporate debt, which paid about 4.4% in interest compared to a yield of 1.2% interest on the safest kinds of corporate debt. The riskiest corporate loans yielded around 5.6%. The pension funds had been settled on a low return from safe corporate bonds because those bonds were standardized, like a Model T Ford. The bonds were regulated by the SEC and traded on exchanges. People understood them. Leveraged loans, however, were very complicated contracts with terms that could vary widely and weren't overseen by a regulator in the same manner as stocks and bonds. The CLO solved this problem. It would standardize leveraged loans in ways that made the pension funds feel safe. The key innovation of CLOs was how they standardized the leveraged loans inside of them. A CLO divided its loans into three big chunks divided by risk. The riskiness of the three groups was determined by where the owner stood in line when it came time to collect the interest payments made by all the borrowers. The first group was the safest and rated with a AAA label. People who owned these AAA loans were the ones to be paid first by the borrowers, and the owners would be the first in line to get their money back if the underlying loans went bust. These AAA investors could sleep easy, but their chunks of the CLO paid the small interest rates because they were so safe. Investors who had a higher appetite for risk could buy the next chunk of the CLO, which was the second riskiest group, called the mezzanine group. People who owned these loans got paid second, and they stood in line behind the AAA people to collect their money if the loans went bad, meaning that they might not get all their money back. Because of this risk, they got paid a higher interest rate. Finally, there was the third and riskiest chunk of the CLO, called the equity chunk. Equity owners got paid last. If the loans failed, they might be wiped out entirely. This meant that a pension fund could order CLO chunks like someone ordering a meal at McDonald's, picking between the AAA, mezzanine, and equity slices of the package. This opened a new pipeline for Robert Hattu and his team of leveraged loan makers. The proliferation of CLOs at Credit Suisse and elsewhere created the steady buyer they had been looking for. Rexnor's debt was chopped up and distributed into a wide variety of funds that were offered by Pop's division. The buyers came storming into Credit Suisse's CLO shop, desperately searching for yield. The Rexnor debt, which was still rated as junk debt, meaning the big credit rating agencies believed the debt was so risky that it was below investment grade, was sliced and split like cord wood and then stacked into a wide variety of funds that were sold to investors. Rexnor's debt ended up in Credit Suisse's offerings with names like the Credit Suisse High Yield Bond Fund, the Credit Suisse Asset Management Income Fund, and the Credit Suisse Floating Rate High Income Fund. All these funds contained debt from numerous corporations that, like Rexnord, had taken out heavy loans of leveraged loans and issued corporate bonds. Okay, so you see that basically what Wall Street banks did was what they did with the CDO, they went right back to and did it again with the CLO. Same thing, same textbook, same game plan. Just roll it right on out. Slice that debt, slice and dice that debt up, sell it in different tranches, put it right out there, and let everybody just scoop it right on up. Okay, let's move on here. So let's talk about the CLO factory. So the majority of CLOs were owned by big institutional investors like insurance companies, mutual funds, and banks. The CLOs helped create more leveraged loans than ever, while dispersing them more broadly than ever throughout the financial system. These loans had one key attribute that made them safe for investors, but more risky for the borrowers like Rexnord. Leveraged loans very often carried variable rates, meaning that the interest rate on the loan could change before the loan was due. This protected investors if rates went up because it shifted more of the risk onto the borrower. If rates rose, the borrower's interest payments increased significantly. None of this seemed like a problem during the years of ZIRP because rates were kept so low. Credit Suisse helped Rexnord roll its debt multiple times, keeping the company one step ahead of the day when it needed to repay the full amount. The rates remained low for Rexnord, and Credit Suisse earned fees on each refinancing. This was the case all across Wall Street. Global investment banking fees rose steadily as QE money was poured into the financial system, hitting a monthly peak of $11.1 billion in June of 2014, surpassing the previous record of $10.7 billion set in the summer of 2007, right before the crash. It was around this time in 2014 that a junk bond analyst named Vicky Bryan noticed a pivotal change in the market for corporate debt. The old rules of junk debt and leveraged loans didn't seem to apply anymore. The market became disjointed completely from economic reality, Bryan recalled. Her job as a junk bond analyst was to hunt for fraud or incompetence at the companies that borrowed junk debt and then warn her clients about it. Her entire business model relied on the fact that when analysts released important information, it affected the market. When Bryan exposed wrongdoing at a company, her clients who owned that company's risky debt could sell it or at least demand a higher interest rate for the risk of owning it. That's how Bryan worked until the dawn of ZIRP, which fundamentally altered the dynamics of corporate debt markets. Around 2014 or 2015, Bryan noticed that she could bring new revelations to the market, but it didn't seem to matter anymore. You've got an artificial bottom, and the higher part of that bottom is set by the Fed. So you can't lose in this market. And if you can't lose, it's not really a market, Bryan said. All that money, believing that it could not lose, began to pour into a new market for leveraged loans and CLOs. At the end of 2010, there had been a little less than $300 billion worth of CLOs in the United States. By the end of 2014, there were $400 billion. By 2018, there would be $617 billion. This created a lot of work for a lot of people like Robert Hitu at Credit Suisse. There was just too much cash chasing every leveraged loan that the bank could sell. Hitu could see what this was doing. More loans were getting sold, and investors were willing to accept more risk with each passing year. So now we're going to talk about caught in a vice. So Hitu described the situation as being caught in a vice. On the one side, there was pressure from investors like pension funds clamoring for loans. On the other side, there were the private equity companies like the Carlyle Group, which were the best source for these new loans. The private equity firms had leverage, and they began to use it to their benefit. A typical leveraged loan was born when a private equity firm like the Carlyle Group landed a deal to buy a company like Rexnord. The private equity companies were the original fountain of eternal debt and were known as sponsors of the loans on Wall Street. After Carlyle sponsored a deal, it approached a bank like Credit Suisse and offered the bank a chance to fund the deal by arranging a group of investors to contribute the money. Hitu was this middleman at the bank, and he was often dependent on the sponsors for his flow of leveraged loans. Over time, the sponsors became more demanding. They knew banks were desperate to secure more leveraged loans. The sponsors sometimes flexed their muscle in irritating ways, like insisting that they could choose which law firm Credit Suisse hired to oversee a deal. The sponsors exerted their bargaining power in more important and worrisome ways. They started to offer leveraged loans for sale that had very loose covenants, meaning the contract terms that protected investors. A typical covenant might dictate that a borrower like Rexnord couldn't immediately go out and take on more debt that made it harder to pay back its earlier loans. Or a covenant might say that a borrower needed to get permission from their lender before selling off assets. These kind of covenants had always been common. But the leveraged loan sponsors started insisting that they be cut. Eventually, the sponsors got so bold that they started sending lists of detailed loan terms, maybe 20 pages long, insisting that they be included in the deal, Hitu recalled. These terms gave the borrowers more flexibility and stripped out covenants that protected the investors. This became so common that Wall Street came up with a nickname for loans with the covenants stripped out, calling them Cov Light loans. It became Hatu's job to take the Cove Light loans out to the market and see if anyone would buy them. He would sometimes insist to the sponsor that if he couldn't find a buyer, he would add covenants back in to protect investors. But he didn't need to. There was always a buyer. A $1 billion loan would have $2 billion worth of takers. This happened repeatedly. The demand for Cove Light loans was intense, which only encouraged the deal sponsors to insist upon them more. There was just too much money looking for yield for investors to demand high standards. It's tough. You see what people agree to, and you're like, oh my God, do you realize what you're agreeing to? Hatu said. These deals get more and more aggressive by the day because the market, again, is supplied with a lot of cash. Hatu was aware of the risk inherent in the leveraged loan business. He also knew that there were benefits. The loans went to companies across the country and gave them credit that they could use to expand, hire workers, or invent new products. And bundling the loans into CLOs could help mitigate the risks for investors by diversifying their exposure and limiting their losses if a handful of the loans went bad. The Cove Light loan, once an exotic debt instrument, became the industry standard. In 2010, they accounted for less than 10% of the leveraged loan market. By 2013, they were over 50%. And by 2019, they accounted for 85% of all the leveraged loans. Carlyle and other private equity firms like Apollo, Bain Capital, and KKR even started their own loan divisions to meet demand, creating and managing CLOs of their own rather than to rely on banks like Credit Suisse. Okay, now we're going to get into a business development corporation, or a BDC. Bankers and private equity firms weren't the only companies competing to issue corporate debt. They were joined by a once obscure type of investment firm called a business development corporation, or BDC, which had been created by Congress in the 1980s. The BDCs got a tax break to lend money to small businesses that were so risky they couldn't get a traditional bank loan. The BDCs bunched these loans together and sold them to investors who could buy pieces of a BDC on the public stock exchange. BDCs had operated in a quiet corner of finance for decades, issuing loans to mid-sized bakeries, medical device makers, or food companies. Most of the loans carried super high interest rates. After 2010, the amount of money under management by BDCs exploded. There were about 40 BDCs managing $27 billion of risky debt in 2010. By 2014, there were 77 of them managing $82 billion. By 2018, some 95 BDCs were managing $101 billion in assets. The rush to extend, package, and sell corporate debt was unstoppable. Corporate borrowing rose to record levels in the United States. At the end of 2010, the total debt of non-financial companies was $6 trillion. That became $7 trillion by the end of 2013, and almost $9 trillion by the end of 2017, and $10 trillion by 2019. A rise in corporate debt embedded a deep set of risks within the American financial system. The risk was double-sided, with borrowers on one side and lenders on the other. When all those companies took on loans or issued bonds, they committed themselves to surviving on the roll. They depended on the ability to roll over the debt at a decent price before it expired, and they had to pay off the full amount. This worked fine as long as the Fed helped to suppress interest rates and keep the financial system afloat on new money. But if the money was withdrawn or interest rates crept higher, the cascading effects would be shattering. Companies would have to pay off the debt or accept much higher interest costs. Defaults would spell more losses for investors. So now we're going to wrap up here with no one in the world of CLOs or leveraged loans seemed to think they could lose. Hatu watched all this unfold, and he noticed the same thing that Vicky Bryan noticed. No one in the world of CLOs or leveraged loans seemed to think they could lose. Investors were buying loans that they knew were crummy, but they operated on the belief that they could sell them when they needed to. Well, the problem is when things don't go well, the markets freeze and you can't sell. It would be easy years later to point fingers at the Wall Street deal makers who built and financed these towers of risky corporate debt. But the financiers were only doing what the Federal Reserve gave them the incentive to do. In 2013, while the FOMC was overseeing its largest round of quantitative easing yet, the Dallas Fed president, Richard Fisher, explicitly pointed out that the policy would primarily benefit private equity firms like Jay Powell's former employer, the Carlyle Group. Fisher challenged the theory that this would create the wealth effect Bernanke hoped for, as higher asset prices translated into more pay and more jobs for working people. It has, I believe, had a wealth effect, but principally for the rich and the quick. The Buffetts, the KKRs, the Carlyles, the Goldman Sachses, the Powells, maybe the Fishers, those who can borrow money for nothing and drive bonds and stocks and property higher in price, and profit goes to their pocket, Fisher said during the meeting. He argued that this was not going to create jobs or boost wages to nearly the degree the Fed hoped it would. That, of course, would depend largely on how the company spent all that borrowed money. Rexnord, for example, borrowed billions of dollars through multiple rounds of debt financing underwritten by Credit Suisse. What happened at Rexnord would illustrate exactly how much the cheap debt would shape the fate of most workers. So that's it there for chapter 9. And, so we can see here the effects now unfolding of quantitative easing. We can see here how the Fed pinning interest rates at zero and then pumping all this money in and then basically penalizing anybody who tried to save money. I mean, everybody had to what they called reach for yield. And in the reaching for the yield, it caused them to go out, and the financiers engineered the CLOs and basically said, hey, we can do it with the CLOs. And they just leveraged up these loans. And then the companies had to live on what they called the roll. Companies to this very day are still living on the roll. And I think one of the great mysteries to me right now is that a lot of banks, particularly the larger banks, have put off all of the, they've done what's called extend and pretend. They're extending and pretending on these loans because a lot of these people would definitely be in default today if they had to go from, paying, 1, 2, 3% in interest rates to paying 7% or 8% in interest rates. That would absolutely break their back, so to speak. So, so why has that not materialized yet? Well, part of it, again, is due to extend and pretend. But like I said, now in the next chapter, as we get into chapter 10, we're going to see how this ultimately hits, where they're going to continue to use Rexnord as their example, as they do throughout the book. But we're going to continue to see, how does this hit the ordinary employee of Rexnord? How does this affect them? What does it do to them? And we'll see that in the next chapter. But so I hope everyone is enjoying these reviews. I hope that everyone is really liking the Lures of Easy Money series. Certainly I could get tons and tons of downloads on this. So definitely the podcast audience is definitely loving it. But like I said, I'll wrap up by basically saying, if you like this, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Please make sure to share these episodes, because if you like this one, I'm sure you'll like the first 10 in the series. And then, like I said, we'll have 8 more episodes here to kind of do the last couple chapters and then kind of wrap this series up. But like I said, I will be back with the next installment very shortly, and please come back to check that out. Thanks a lot. See ya.